Hi, I'm Sam Perlow-Freeman, Research Coordinator at Campaign Against Arms Trade. This video provides an introduction to CAT's online interactive data browser for export licenses issued by the government since 2008. You can find the browser on CAT's homepage towards the bottom under Resources and Data. Here, UK Arms Export Licenses. This covers licenses for the export of arms and of so-called dual-use goods. CAT's browser is based on data published by the government, but it presents it in a far more user-friendly and interactive format, and it is probably the single most important source of data on UK arms exports. This video is divided into several sections. Section 2, after this introduction, provides a brief explanation of the export licensing system which lies behind all the data we are talking about. Section 3 shows you how to do a basic search of the CAT database and how to interpret the results, including, very importantly, the limitations of the data. Then, Section 4 shows how to refine your search by applying some basic filters to the database. In Section 5, we start drilling down into the details of the license data, which shows what types of equipment have been licensed to whom, when, and with what types of license. How to interpret the different pieces of information provided about each license, and again some of the limitations of the data. Then, in Section 6, we will go over some more detailed specialised filters you can apply to your searches for when you really want to isolate specific information. In Section 7, we talk about a snafu that has arisen for the most recent years of data due to changes in the government's online export license system, which has greatly reduced the detail we are given on most licenses, and how the browser deals with this less detailed data. Section 8 looks at a particular type of license, so-called incorporation licenses, which allow the export of components to one country that are then incorporated into weapons that are sold on to a third country. Finally, Section 9 covers the information the browser holds on the companies applying for and receiving export licenses. This is not regularly published by the government, but can sometimes be obtained through Freedom of Information requests. This data is therefore only partial and not a complete picture of which companies are most involved in the arms trade. In total, this video lasts about an hour and a quarter. It is rather a lot to take in all in one go, so you may well want to take it one section at a time. And do take time to play around with the different features you learn about as you go, so as to become familiar with them. So, what are export licenses? An export license is something you need if you want to export any type of controlled goods, be that equipment, software, or technology, out of the UK. Controlled goods fall into two categories: military goods and dual-use goods. There are comprehensive lists which the UK applies, more or less in common with the EU, of what is covered by these controls, namely the military list and the dual-use list. Each of these are broken down into different categories. Here are some of the most used categories on the military list. For example, ML10 includes military aircraft and components. ML4 covers bombs and missiles and their components, etc. The dual use list is far longer and more complicated, and we won't just go into it here. It's not just arms companies that use export licenses. A civil manufacturer might well need them for dual-use goods, or an IT company providing information security software, for example. Companies or individuals apply for export licenses from the Export Control Joint Unit, which is part of the Department for Business and Trade. How these applications are evaluated, the criteria that are supposed to be applied to decide whether to issue or to refuse an export license, and everything that is wrong with this system that still allows arms to be supplied to highly repressive regimes and countries engaging in brutal wars, occupations, and genocide, is something that Kat has written about a great deal. And you can find plenty of material on our website. There are three main types of export licenses, as listed here. There are also what is known as trade control licenses, often called brokerage licenses, which is what you need if you are a UK citizen or are based in the UK and you want to sell or arrange the sale of controlled goods from one country, not in the UK, to a third country. However, we will be concentrating on export licenses. The most common type of export license is the Single Individual Export License, or SEAL, which allows the export of a limited quantity and value of specified equipment to a single overseas destination. SEALs are valid for 2 years, allowing for one or multiple shipments up to the maximum levels. These are the only licenses that have a financial value attached to them. Next is the Open Individual Export License, or OIL. This allows for the export of unlimited quantities and value of the specified equipment to one or more destinations listed on the license. Some OILs cover only one destination or a few, but some allow exports to well over 40 countries. They sometimes also cover a very long list of types of equipment. OILs are usually valid for 5 years, although some are only valid for 3. OILs have no financial value attached as they are unlimited, and while companies must report to the government how often they use an OIL to make exports to each country, the government does not collect or publish information on the total quantity of value of goods exported using an OIL. Finally, there are open general export licenses, or OGLs. These operate rather differently from SEALs or OILs. Instead of companies applying for them, OGLs are pre-issued by the government with lists of what goods are covered by the license and what destinations. Companies may then register for these OGLs, subject to various administrative conditions. But once they have done so, they may export unlimited quantities of equipment covered by the OGL to the listed countries without further need for license applications. OGLs, moreover, are valid indefinitely until amended or revoked. Once again, while companies must keep records of their use of an OGL and report the number of times they have used it for each destination, the government does not even collect data on how much has actually been exported using an OGL. These open licenses, OILs and OGLs, mean that it is impossible to know, indeed even the government doesn't know, the actual quantity and value of arms exported from the UK to any country or in total. They create, in short, a huge gap in transparency in the arms trade. The government publishes information on export licenses in different ways, and these form the source for Kat's browser. First, there is an online searchable database, although it is not very user-friendly, and it doesn't allow you to find individual licenses, only what has been licensed over a minimum search period of 30 days. There is also a recent problem that has developed due to a change in the government's online systems, which means that a lot of the most recent license data is not included in this database. We will discuss this further later on. Then there are annual and quarterly reports which present highly aggregated data for each year or quarter in spreadsheet form. This is even less detailed and user-friendly, but at least it has all the data. These two sources cover seals and oils, as well as trade control licenses, but not ogles, which are listed on a separate website showing all currently valid ogles that companies can register for. CAT's browser uses an algorithm to scrape the data from these sources to provide a database that is far more user-friendly. You can search down to the individual day, usually identifying individual licenses. There are a lot more search and filter options, as well as graphical presentations and other useful info. And this is what we will look at now. With this background, let's take a look at the data browser. On the front page, we are invited to enter a destination country to search for data on and a start date for our search. The information in the database, based on the government's own database, goes back as far as 2008. There are also a number of curated search options that you can click on. For example, exports to Saudi Arabia since the start of the Yemen war, exports of tear gas, and so on. But let's start with the broadest possible search. We leave the country field blank, which by default selects the whole world, and likewise the date field, which means back to 2008, and just click search. Let's take a look at these results. There is a note at the top about why some license information has less detail. We will come back to that. And then we see the first big headline figure for the total value of military export licenses issued to all destinations since 2008, £83 billion, or to be precise, 82,819,989,219 pounds. These come from 124,021 limited value standard licenses. These are the seals we talked about earlier. This big headline figure is also in some ways the most misleading because it does not include exports conducted using open licenses, oils and ogles, which CAT estimates to cover about half of all UK arms exports on average. So this figure, though it is a very large amount of money and a very large quantity of arms, is a major undercount. Below, we see that there have been 22,872 unlimited open licenses issued. These are the oils we talked about, as well as the brokerage or trade control licenses, some of which are unlimited and some of which do have a quantitative limit, but which is not published. In this count, each separate destination for the same license, as oils can have many different destinations permitted, is counted as one separate license. So an oil covering 30 destinations counts 30 to the total. Note that ogles are not shown here. As I say, these licenses are pre-issued by the government. Many companies can and do register for them, and they are listed on a separate website. To the right, we see bar charts showing the value of seals issued each year and the number of unlimited or unknown value licenses. Do these figures show the value of exported goods? No, they do not. The government does not collect or publish this information on actual deliveries of arms. I've said that the figures are a serious undercount due to open licenses, and that is true. But with seals, it can also be inaccurate in the other direction, as companies do not always use the full value of seals, or sometimes, due to some unforeseen difficulties, they aren't used at all. We know of cases where some quite high value seals have gone completely unused. Looking further down, we see the value of seals approved by destination, listed by most notable. To be honest, I'm not quite sure what that means. By far the biggest recipient country since 2008 is Saudi Arabia, with £18 billion worth of seals, followed by the USA with £11 billion. We are invited to see further results. The link is here at the bottom of the table. Here we go. And we get a full country list ordered by value. We also see the number of seals and also the number of unlimited license issued to each country. We can also download the data as a CSV file. On the right, we see some of the most common items that are licensed for export. Let's look at the full ordered list again. These are the broad summary descriptions of items published by the government of what equipment is on each license. The most common, as we see, is components for combat aircraft, for which there have been about 9,100 licenses, including about 6,100 single licenses and 2,900 unlimited. That doesn't quite add up due to rounding. Now, this description, components for combat aircraft, is incredibly broad. It could mean, in some cases, some small electronic components like actuators, or it could, in other cases, mean the aircraft wings. Both would count as components, although engines are treated separately. See components for military aero engines here with 5,900 licenses. Going back to the main page, we also see the value of licenses by categories on the military list. By far the highest value of licenses is for ML10, military aircraft, including drones and helicopters and their components, with £34 billion, over 40% of the total, followed by ML4, bombs, missiles, grenades, etc., and again their components at £16 billion. We also have the number of export license applications per company that we know about. This is very partial data as it is collected from Freedom of Information requests rather than comprehensive data published by the government, and we will come back to this. So far, we have been looking at the complete data set, all military export licenses issued since 2008. Let's now start narrowing down our search using some of the basic filter options which we find on the left-hand side. The most obvious one to start with is to look for a particular country or group of countries. This is under Destination. We click on the plus sign and enter a country name. Let's go for Saudi Arabia, for example, the UK's biggest single arms customer over the whole period. We now have the figures just for the number and value of export licenses to Saudi Arabia. 1,775 standard or single licenses worth £18 billion, or 17.6 billion to be precise, and 334 open licenses or unspecified trade control licenses. And we have all the same statistics as before. The bar charts, the number of licenses for different items, the licenses by category, and so on. Next, we might want to specify a date range. For example, we might choose the period when Saudi Arabia was actively involved in the war of Yemen. That was from the 25th of March 2015 to the 1st of April 2022, when there was a ceasefire. The situation in Yemen is far from at peace, and Saudi Arabia is still involved in various ways, but at least the bombing has stopped since then. So we enter our start date, first the year, 2015. Slightly annoyingly, as soon as you enter one something, it starts recalculating and you have to scroll back down. And then the month, March, and the date, the 25th. And likewise, the end date, 2022, April the 1st. So we now have a figure of £7.1 billion by value between these two dates. We might want to further narrow our search, for example, just looking at one or more military list categories. I will select, for example, where are we? Rating. ML4, grenades, bombs, and missiles, etc. There were £4 billion worth of such licenses, not counting open licenses, during this time period. I'm going to undo that one for now by clicking on the X beside the filter term or beside the filter condition, the rating. So we're back to the 7.1 billion for all licenses to Saudi Arabia. We can select more than one country. For example, we could select all the countries that were at one time or another part of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. Not all of them were involved for the whole time, but let's not worry about that from now. So I am going to add Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, there were quite a lot of them, Qatar, Sudan, not South Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates. No, I don't want the continental shelf United Kingdom sector. I wanted the United Arab Emirates. That's better. You can easily correct your mistakes. Let's wait. So here we are, £9.5 billion worth of licenses to these countries, 3,506 limited licenses, 653 unlimited during the period of the bombing of Yemen. Although, as I say, some of these countries were only involved for the first couple of years. So far, we've just been looking at the overall statistics on licenses for whatever search we've applied. Now it's time to start delving into the details of the licenses themselves. We can do this either by clicking on Licenses here at the top, just below UK export license data, or by clicking here on See Full Results, just below the top line statistics. Here we go. 3,854 results. That's a lot of data. Note that the same filters are applied here for countries and dates. Whatever filters we choose, we can always go back and forth between the overview and the license list. So I can add a filter to the license list, say just ML1 licenses, small arms. We now have just 608 results. and go back to the overview. Hold on. Which is now just the statistics for ML1 licenses, £122 million. Then I can remove that filter for ML1 and then go back to the license list again with the filter removed. Here we are. The licenses are ordered by most recent, that is newest to oldest, but we can instead order by destination or by most valuable. If we choose most valuable, then all the open licenses will go to the bottom as they have no financial value attached. Let's stick with most recent for now. Let's look at the first results in the list so that we can understand all the different pieces of information that we're given. First on the list, we see the date the license was issued, given as year, month, day. So this is the 1st of April 2022, the last date of our search period. Next, we have the type of license, a seal, which to remind you is single individual export license, limited quantity and value. It was approved. We can also include licenses that were refused in our search. There aren't many of them. And there were also licenses that were revoked, issued, but then cancelled. Finally, on the left-hand side, we have the destination, Bahrain. Next, we have the item descriptions of what was actually included on the license. These are grouped by military list categories. And for seals, at least, for each ML category, we have the value of the goods licensed. So we have £200 worth of gun silencers in the ML1 category, £2,560 of shotgun ammunition in the ML3 category, and £28,650 of sporting shotguns in the FRAI category. That's a special category for sporting guns. With guns and other complete small arms, we are also given the number of units licensed, in this case just one, so that's quite an expensive shotgun. Scrolling down a bit further, here's one for Egypt on the 31st of March 2022. It's also a seal, and there's a long list of stuff here, but there's two things to note. One is that all the items have temporary beside them. This means that the equipment is only licensed for temporary export and must eventually be returned to the UK. This may be equipment that was exported for testing and evaluation by a potential customer, or for display at an arms fair, or, not very likely in this case, for repair by the original manufacturer before return to the UK. The other thing to note is that there are several items in some ML categories. For example, there are 6 items here listed under ML5, and we have no way of knowing the breakdown of the value, £850,250, between these different items. Here's another thing to look for, this one here, to the United Arab Emirates. It says 2 licenses. That is, 2 licenses of the same type to the same destination on the same day. And we can't always say what was in one license and what was in the other. Here there are only 2 items, so it can only be that each license included one of them. But again, we can't break down the value between the 2. Note that it says 2 in brackets besides ML10, indicating 2 licenses that included items in this category. Let's go on down and find an open license. Here's one to Kuwait on 29th of March 2022. It's an oil, an open individual export license, which remember allows for unlimited exports and is usually valid 5 years. This oil includes both military and dual-use goods. There is technology for global navigation systems jamming equipment, coded ML22, but also counter-improvised explosive device equipment, coded 5A001. Codes that begin with a number rather than a letter are dual use. This is also the first footnote that we've seen. License footnote, license granted for explosive detection disposal purposes. They can apply to any type of license. It seems to be rather haphazard when they provide a footnote and when they don't. While seals are only for a single destination, oils can have multiple destinations approved, and here we see that this one authorises export to 22 countries. I'll open this link in a new tab. And here we have a full list of all the countries the license applies to. Bangladesh, Burkina Faso. Aha, we actually have some refusals here. They applied for 22 countries, but it was only approved for 19 of them, with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates refused. Back to the main results page. The browser shows 20 results at a time, but we can click on Load More to get more of them. Scrolling on down, I'm going to try to find a trade control license, and we're going to need to load yet another 20 results. Here we are, a Citical, that is a standard individual trade control license, 9th of March 2022, for components for NBC protective defensive equipment. NBC stands for nuclear, biological, chemical, to be sold to the United Arab Emirates. We have an additional piece of information that the source country is the United States of America. Remember that a trade control or brokerage license is where the license holder is making or arranging a sale for stuff that never actually enters the UK. In this case, it is going from the United States to the UAE. But because the broker is either based in the UK or a UK citizen, they need to have a license to make the deal. Citicals are for a limited quantity of equipment, but we don't know the quantity or value. Now that we've gone over the basics of the license information, let's look at a few more ways of filtering the data. For simplicity, I've gone back to looking at just Saudi Arabia. We've already seen how to filter for one or more destination country, for a date range, and for the military list categories of equipment. We can actually search for particular items or groups of items. That is, the item descriptions listed under each license. For example, one we might be particularly concerned with in relation to the war in Yemen or other conflicts is components for combat aircraft. So I'll start typing that, and there we select that item. Make sure you get the spelling right, or it won't work. We've now reduced the search to 65 results. Note it still shows other items, but it will only show licenses that include the item we've selected. If we go back to Overview, we will see that there is no longer a value given. This is because we can't always separate out the portion of the license value that is specifically for our chosen item, as opposed to other items in the same ML category, in this case, ML10 for aircraft and related equipment. We do see that there are 35 single licenses and 37 open licenses. However, we might also want other things to do with combat aircraft, for example, relevant software and technology. So what we can do is we start typing combat aircraft, and then we select the item in quote marks. What this does is return licenses with item descriptions that include the phrase combat aircraft. It's given us 7 more results. And note items like equipment for the production of combat aircraft and technology for combat aircraft. There are also a few pre-prepared searches that we can do for groups of items. One that may be particularly relevant in relation to internal repression is the anti-protest group. That includes things like tear gas, riot shields, so-called less lethal ammunition and weapons, all of which are routinely used for repression of protests. So we start typing anti-protest group. Here we are. And here we go. So, for example, we see items like civil riot control agent protection equipment, anti-riot guns, crowd control ammunition, tear gas irritant ammunition, and so on. Let's continue. I'll remove that filter. We can search for company, looking for licenses issued to specific companies. I will come back to that as the data is very incomplete and it's a bit complicated. Here's the use filter. By default, the browser only searches for military goods, but we can also look for dual use goods, or indeed only for dual use. Here we go. We're now up to 1,954 results. We've got a lot of things that are probably for industrial use, but are controlled goods because they also have military applications. But here, this one for information security equipment, that might be more concerning as it might involve equipment used for surveillance. Limit, standard or unlimited. If we just select standard, it will only show us seals. If select unlimited, it will select everything but seals, open licenses, and trade control licenses. Data source, I'll come back to that. License type, export, trade, or transshipment. By default, all are selected. Export is the seals and oils for direct export to the recipient country. Trade is those brokerage licenses I was talking about earlier, where you are arranging or facilitating the sale of goods that aren't actually coming from the UK. So when I untick export, we just have these citicles and oiticles, mostly. Citicles, oiticles, and so forth. Finally, transshipment. These are very rare. Let's take a look. Untick trade. There's just one here, a standard individual transshipment license. These are for goods that are just transiting the UK from somewhere else on their way to their final destination, in this case, Saudi Arabia. Mostly these are covered by open general licenses, so companies don't need to apply for an individual transshipment license. Let's select all of those again. So export comes back And trade comes back. The next filter is status here. At present, we only have licenses that were either approved or revoked. That's the default setting. So revoked is ones that were initially approved and then cancelled. But we can also select for licenses that were refused or, much more rarely, unused. Let's select refused, and then let's untick approved so that we can more easily see the refused and revoked ones. So here we have some oils that were refused to Saudi Arabia. Note they are to multiple destinations, so they might have been approved for some of the others. In fact, this one to 22 countries, we've seen it before. It was the one that was refused to Egypt, Saudi, and UAE, but approved to all the other ones. Here's one that was revoked. It was issued on the 29th of July 2019, but subsequently revoked on the 16th of September 2019. The next filter is permanent or temporary licenses. So we might just want to search for permanent licenses, that is excluding goods that are exported temporarily, but which must ultimately be returned to the UK. Temporary licenses are probably of less concern. The final two, supply type and company match, I will come back to. Now to introduce a complication that has arisen in recent years. This relates to where CAT gets the data for the browser. It comes from an online government export license database from the Export Control Joint Unit. Here. There it is. The problem with this database is that it's rather unwieldy, not very user-friendly. Our browser scrapes the data from the ECGJU database and presents it in the way you see now, with a lot more search options. The ECJU database, in turn, gets its data from the online export license application platform, Spire. This is where companies apply for export licenses, and the data on the application and the subsequent decisions is all transferred to the ECJU database, and from there to ours. The problem that has arisen since 2023 is that the government has been introducing a new online license application platform called Lite, which doesn't connect with the database. This is being gradually rolled out, and more license applications are going through the new system and therefore don't make their way to the ECJU database or to ours. The ECJU is developing a new online database that will connect to Lite, but we have no idea when that will be ready. However, not all is lost. The government also publishes annual and quarterly reports. Here it is, this page here, quarterly licensing statistics, and there's also annual licensing statistics somewhere. This has all the same data, but it's all aggregated together for the quarter or year, so that we can't separate out individual licenses or see exactly when different items were licensed. Our browser now scrapes this data from the quarterly reports as well, so that we can include all the license data. Let's take a look at some more recent export license information. For example, all licenses to Turkey since 2021, 5 years of data. So here we go, Turkey. 2021 search, a completely new search. Here's the overview page again, just under £1.2 billion worth of single licenses and 56 open or unknown value licenses. Now let's go to the license list. Right at the top, we see a big block of license data, which rather than a single date says date between 2025 1001 and 2025 1231. That is 1st October to 31st December 2025, quarter 4 of 2025. It says seal, but in this case it's multiple seals. As the note at the top says, this block represents a group of licenses with unknown dates and limited details. These licenses were omitted from the official online exports database, but included in the totals of quarterly government statistics. In other words, these are the licenses that went through light. Those that went through the old Spire system and that are included in the online database have been separated out individually. So we have a long list of item descriptions, starting with components for air-to-surface missiles and components for combat helicopters. Some we can see have been the subject of multiple licenses, such as 2 licenses that included components for combat naval vessels. At the side are the figures for the total value of all these licenses broken down by ML category. For example, we have 5,287,000 odd in the ML4 category. On the left, we see a list of potential incorporation destinations. I'll come back to what this means in the next section. Scrolling down, we have another similar block for the same range of dates. Why are these separate? The difference here is that there are no incorporation destinations. And again, hold that thought. I will come back to it in the next section. Finally, we get to some individual licenses. These are the ones that went through the old Spire system and thus are still searchable via the online database. Here's one dated the 10th of December 2025, an article covering a lot of different things. There's just one seal that's listed individually here before we get to the next quarterly block. So we currently have a mix of license data from Spire that can be separated out to individual days and usually individual licenses, and other data from Light that can only be viewed as a large block of licenses based on the quarterly reports. You can choose to view just one of these 2 types of data by using the data source filter here on the left. High detail reports shows only the detailed, individually dated license data that comes from the government's online database. Low detailed statistics shows only the aggregated quarterly data that comes from the annual and quarterly spreadsheets. By default, both are selected. Let's return to these mysterious incorporation licenses. Let's do a new search, one of the most popular at the moment, for export licenses to Israel since October 7th, 2023. Here we go. Here's the overview stats. £172 million worth of seals, of which we see the great majority is shown as in December 2024. In fact, these are mostly from the block of licenses for October to December 2024, but the browser counts them as being from the end of the period. We have 87 standard or single licenses and 14 open unlimited licenses. Let's go to the license list. The first entry is a block for the most recent period of data, the fourth quarter of 2025. And these are our incorporation licenses. A total value of £11 million, if you add the values up on the right, a variety of items in different categories. As I said, because these are only reported by the quarter, we can't separate them out by individual licenses. So what is an incorporation license? It's a type of seal that allows equipment to be exported to country A, to be incorporated into larger systems or pieces of equipment that are then re-exported to country B. In this case, country A is Israel. So these are presumably things that are sold to Israeli arms companies to go into stuff they produce for onward export. As for the country B, there can be more than one of them for any license. For these licenses, we have just a list of 20 potential incorporation destinations from Australia to the United States of America. One of them is actually the United Kingdom. In other words, the components exported with this license will be used to make larger pieces of equipment which might then be exported back to the UK. Why only potential destinations? Well, the government's reporting, even in the online database, only gives very limited information about the ultimate destinations, the ultimate end users of goods exported using incorporation seals. Basically, it gives broad brush information about the incorporation destinations over a period of time, but not specific to each license. Sometimes our browser's cunning algorithm is able to establish these more certainly, but especially with these quarterly blocks of licenses, it is not always possible. We can say that at least one of the licenses issued to Israel this quarter has each of these 20 countries as an ultimate end user, but not which licenses are for which countries. Again, for those blocks of licenses that do not list potential incorporation license destinations, like this one here, for the same period, these are standard seals. In other words, they do not authorize re-export of the goods exported to Israel, whether directly or following incorporation into larger systems. If we scroll a little further, we can see one incorporation seal that is listed separately. In other words, it comes from the old online system and is included in the government's database. It's dated the 25th of April 2025 for components for targeting equipment, category ML5, worth £17,640. This time, there is only one definite incorporation destination, Thailand. So these components are to be used by an Israeli arms company to make some sort of targeting equipment, which will then be exported to Thailand. As we scroll further, we can see more cases where we only have potential incorporation destinations. So here's one to Republic of Moldova and/or the United Kingdom, or both. And others where we can be more definite. Load some more results. There we go. Here's one that's definitely for incorporation and re-export to the Philippines on the 26th of November 2024. Open individual export licenses, oils, are also sometimes listed as for incorporation, but this is rarer and probably less significant a distinction as oils can already list multiple destinations. If we look at one more filter, the supply type filter, we see that it lists direct licenses, that is, the ones that are not for incorporation, which means for seals that they must ultimately be for users within the original destination country. We can also choose just licenses that are for incorporation, which only includes the incorporation licenses. But we can also select licenses to go to our chosen destination after incorporation. I'm going to select that, and for convenience, I'm going to unselect the other two. So I'll unselect direct and I'll unselect for incorporation. So these are licenses to other countries, not Israel, but which are or might be for incorporation and ultimate re-export to Israel. So we start with a block of licenses to the United States, again for the period October 1st to 31st December 2025, the last quarter. They're incorporation licenses, a whole load of them, lots of different items, and a long list of potential incorporation destinations, one of which is Israel. So Israel is an incorporation destination for one or more of the licenses issued to the US in this quarter and in this block, but we don't know which, and we don't know how many of these different items and licenses had Israel as an authorized final destination for the goods. Next, we have a block of licenses for the same period where the initial recipient or end user is Germany. Again, Israel is one of the potential incorporation destinations. So again, most of the components and so forth shown in this block of licenses will probably not end up in stuff that's sent by Germany to Israel, but some of it likely will. If we scroll down even further, we've got a block of licenses to Finland, again with lots of potential incorporation destinations, including Israel. But if we scroll a little bit further, we've got a single license dated 12th of June 2025 for the United States of America initially, for components for combat aircraft, and this time there is a list of definite incorporation destinations, including Israel. So this license allows these components to be exported to the US to be included in a larger system, presumably either a combat aircraft or some larger subsystem of a combat aircraft, which can then be exported to this whole long list of countries. But just below it is another one for the US, where again we only have potential incorporation destinations. We can't say for sure that any of them are the actual ultimate end users of this equipment, just that it must be one or more from this long list. If this is not very satisfying, it's sort of like Schrödinger's export license. It might allow onward export to Israel, but we can't tell. Well, that's because it is very unsatisfying and it represents a serious lack of transparency in the information provided by the government. When the UK allows exports of military components to foreign arms companies to be used to produce equipment for onward export, they simply don't tell us who the final recipients are for these onward exports. They just leave us guessing. One thing the government doesn't tell you in the information it publishes on export licenses is who actually gets those licenses. That is, which companies applied for and received the licenses. However, we have sometimes been able to get this information through freedom of information requests to the Department for Business and Trade, which is responsible for export licensing. But it is a bit hit and miss. When CAT and other campaigners and journalists, etc., make FOI requests for the companies behind export license applications, we sometimes run up against two common exemptions from the Freedom of Information Act. First, Section 43 for commercial interests, the argument that releasing the information would harm the company's commercial interests. And second, Section 41, the exemption for information provided in confidence, which includes the information submitted by companies in their export license applications. However, there is a public interest test whereby the DB team must weigh up the public interest in disclosing the information versus the company's interests in keeping it secret and the issue of their confidentiality. This can be appealed if they refuse. So sometimes they will provide information on companies receiving export licenses, and sometimes they don't. For a while, we were able to get fairly comprehensive but not very detailed information on the companies applying to export licenses to all countries. We made an annual request for the number of applications by each company to each country, along with the ML categories in each application. And we received this information each year for the period 2008 to 2015. This did not include the date of each license or application, so in most cases we could not match this information up to specific licenses in the browser. So for those years, we know how many licenses each company applied for to each country in each category, but not usually which licenses, although sometimes it's possible to match them up. However, when we put in the 2016 request, the government decided that it was just a bit too easy some of the time to piece together information from the FOI responses with the information on our browser. They called it the mosaic effect. And that therefore this broad brush disclosure of information on every company that had applied for licenses to any countries went against the exemption for information provided in confidence. Since then, however, we and others have successfully made rather more limited and specific FOI requests for company export licenses, when we focused on a specific company or recipient country, for example, especially where the public interest case is strongest. It might not surprise you to learn, for example, that we have had a lot of very specific information disclosed through FOIs on which companies have received export licenses to Israel, especially for the past few years. The point of all this is that it is important to know, when you search the browser for information on particular companies, that this information is only very partial. It cannot usually tell you exactly how many licenses a company has received in a given period, especially since 2015. It's also very selective. So we know a lot more about licenses to Israel, companies with licenses to Israel and to certain other countries like the UAE than licenses to other countries. So it could be a bit distorting if you were to take it as a sort of overall picture of which companies get export licenses where. Moreover, where the FOI requests, the earlier ones, didn't include a request for the exact date of the license, the browser usually can't identify which specific licenses are involved. So, let's take a look at how we can see this information in the browser. First, let's just see what we've got in the case of the destination where we have most information, namely Israel. So here's the results of a search for licenses to Israel up to 2024, which is when our most recent company FOI request goes up to. It's a bit trickier for the licenses and the quarterly blocks at the top, the ones from Light, but as we scroll down, we can see that most licenses are associated with a specific company. Teledyne, Instro Precision, Tyco Electronics, GKN, etc., etc. At least till we get back to before October 2021. There's a few also where there's been requests for specific companies, especially subsidiaries of Elbit Systems UK, which has been a focus for many campaigners and researchers. So there's quite a lot for the Elbit companies even before 2021. Another thing we can do is to search for specific companies. And the browser algorithm also conveniently links up known subsidiaries. Let's go back to searching for all countries. And we're going to put in a request for Leonardo, for example, a major Italian arms company with a large UK subsidiary. They include the former Westland helicopters in Yeovil and a lot of military electronics, including components for the F-35 combat aircraft. Here we go, Leonardo. So we have a few specific licenses to Israel here. Then we have a bunch, when we get before 2021, we have a bunch of licenses from 2016 to 2020 for certain ML categories, but no specifics. That's because we put in a rather limited request for these years for companies with these categories of licenses to Israel. Basically, when we were testing the waters after the government started refusing our more comprehensive requests. Then, when we get down to 2015, we have a lot more entries for a lot more countries. We have licenses to Indonesia, the USA, Peru, Singapore, Serbia, and many more. Many of these are for Selex ES Limited, which was a subsidiary of Leonardo. These were from the days of the comprehensive requests, all companies to all countries, but without dates. So we can't mostly identify the details of specific licenses. But look, here's one from the 4th of December 2015 to the United Arab Emirates, covering military components for weapons control equipment and military guidance and navigation equipment. I guess that this can be identified because it was the only seal to UAE in 2015 covering this specific combination of ML categories, ML5 and ML11. So the algorithm is able to work out exactly what license this one was. And actually, that's the exact sort of reason why the government started refusing these broad brush FOI requests, what they called the mosaic effect, combining the information from two sources. The final thing we can do is to look only for licenses where we know the identity of the company receiving it. So let's remove the specific company filter. So this is now all licenses to all countries up to 2024. So we go down to the company match filter. Here we are, matching and non-matching. And let's untick non-matching, no other filters. And we've got 3,689 results out of what was originally a total of 133,000 licenses in total. So that's less than 3% of the licenses. As you can see, most of the recent ones are to Israel. We should get some ones going to the UAE in there. We've got an FOI, but it hasn't all been uploaded. So that shows you how partial this very specific company data is. This does not, however, cover the cases where we know that a company has licenses to a given destination, but not which specific licenses, like from that earlier period, 2008 to 15. So this is a very useful tool, but you need to be careful of saying too much because there are so many gaps in this company data. Be careful of making statements such as, this company is the biggest seller of arms to that country. Even for Israel, we have very good data on companies from October 2021 to the end of 2024, but much more partial data for earlier years. And we also know more specific data for certain companies like Elbit Systems UK and its subsidiaries. That brings us to the end of the video. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Do play around with it yourself. And once again, here's the link to the browser. Thank you very much.